a great pleasure as past president now to come to this climax of today's event, which is the Hermann Pálsson lecture. And just to remind you that this is our annual commemorative lecture for the great Hermann, who was one of the towering figures within Northern Studies in its early days. The nature of the lectures that we have within the series are very much designed to reflect the polymath that was Hermann, covering the full range, whether it be the saga studies or whether it be aspects of modern diaspora and cultural studies that were part and parcel of Hermann's research and research interests over the many decades. And today, I'm delighted to introduce to you Professor Graeme Morton from the University of Dundee, Professor of Modern Scottish History at the University of Dundee, and also Director of the Centre for Scottish Culture there. I've known Graeme for a number of years and actually first properly met him just after he left University of Edinburgh and gone to the University of Guelph for the foundation chair there, and that has laid, no puns intended here, has laid the foundations for a range of research that part of which we'll be hearing the fruits this afternoon, but also current continuing work on the censuses and Scottish populations moving into Canada. And getting the broader sense of identity, source, backgrounds, the context into which they were moving. Today, however, we're going to be hearing an aspect of Graeme's work which is very close to my own heart. It is that environmental focus, looking at the drivers in some ways that may have encouraged people to look from the grim, grey, dreich miserableness. Well, I can say this sitting in Menorca at the moment, but having driven down through the rain and the gale force winds on my way to Edinburgh Airport this morning, I can say, yes, the grey, grim, dreich miserableness of Scotland and the lure and attraction, as we've heard from the presentations earlier on, if the summers and springs are anything to go by, then winter is nothing to worry about in Canada. The push and the drive from the environmental perspective over the 2 centuries, or slightly over, from 1770 to 1988. So without any further ado, Graeme, I'm delighted to hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Richard. Let me just get my screen share going. Hope that's all good for everyone. Great. Well, thank you, Richard, and thank you, the Scottish Society for Northern Scholars, for this wonderful invitation to speak to you today. And it's a great honour, of course, to join that list of rather impressive group of people who have given this particular memorial lecture to such a wonderful scholar. So I'm very proud and grateful for the invitation. So as Richard was saying, I am one who left the cold country to go off to Canada, and despite the Canadian snow, I'm still happy to call it a warmer climate than we're used to here. And also, I'm one of these returnees who came back to Scotland after nearly 10 years in Canada, and came to Scotland's sunniest campus, to Dundee. I know it's a claim the Aberdonians like, but they've got rather some strong wind coming off the North Sea that's going to impact them. So today I'm going to talk about the climatic motive for leaving Scotland, and this comes out of research I actually started in Canada. Typical Canadian funding, it was $64,000, so it's a $64,000 question. And I wanted to look at some of the subsidiary factors behind immigration. And for me, that was looking at issues of climate. So as we heard earlier from Tanya, that Scotland has contributed in significant per capita terms to the estimated 44 million European migrants who sought a life elsewhere during the period 1821 to 1914. Roughly about 2 million of that are thought to be Scots. And the structural underpinning for that movement was, for Scotland, comparatively not unusual, driven chiefly by economic dislocation, food and resource shortage. Yeah, we know it was rarely the most destitute, nor was it overwhelmingly the agricultural class or the unskilled who arrived at the docks of Greenock or elsewhere to sail Firth of Scotland. And while many of those migrants judged their prospects of staying in Scotland to be limited, both economically and socially, they were persuaded and economically, compelled to leave. It wasn't at the barrel of a gun, for example, certainly not compared to other migrant groups. So it's a decision that's personal and contingent on local circumstances and resources, but of course broader economic and demographic factors come into play there. And my focus today is on one of those, both universal but also specific factors, and that's the nation's climate. We know that you can go a short distance and the weather will change. There's a lovely episode of Billy Connolly's World Tour of Scotland, where he goes up to Dundee Law, a picture of which you saw from Tanya's presentation earlier, and he gets all 4 seasons in 15 minutes of filming. So we know that Scotland's weather is particularly changeable. Globally, the association between extreme weather and patterns of migration has focused chiefly on the consequences of environmental and social disaster. Flood, hurricane, environmental change have been the greatest contributors to climate-induced migration. Historically, climate causes have been attributed to food shortages and mass hunger, social discord, open warfare, planned and unplanned flight, forcing homelessness and statelessness. On our TV screens at the moment, the catastrophic flooding in British Columbia has had a devastating impact on those in its midst, but also will lead, it is claimed, to shortages and higher food prices across Canada, as the port of Vancouver, the nation's largest port, is currently inaccessible by road. And in COP26, we heard how a global temperature rise of 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels will increase the incidence and worsen the effect of climate events. Wave heights, sea levels have risen, obvious danger for low-lying territory. And Scotland is getting a little sunnier, it's getting windier, it's also getting wetter. If we look back to data from 1884, right forward to the early 2000s, the 10 hottest years in Scotland have been since 2002. 5 of the 10 coldest years have been since 1900. Scotland is a colder nation then than it is now, or Scotland was a colder nation then than it is now. But I will show you how that temperature rise was increasing. We heard, we heard earlier from Tanya on the numbers of Scots who are leaving and the greater proportion of the greater levels of migration coming out of Scotland. And my first table here is to show you that. We could see that Scotland's population grew at a lower rate than the population change, the first 2 pink columns, than in England. Scotland's population doubled between 1831 and 1911, but this was significantly less than the near trebling of the population of England and Wales. So Scotland's population is growing at a slower rate. If we look at birth rate and death rate, accrued birth and accrued death rate, there's not a lot of difference there. We're having babies and dying at similar rates north and south of the border, but then we look at net out migration and we see in particular how much Scotland is losing its population. So the impact of emigration on Scottish society is profound, has been profound, and that certainly carries on throughout my period and into certainly the early decades of the 20th century. And this was despite, over the 19th century, despite more jobs being created, industrialization, the Industrial Revolution, the economic miracle of the Victorian age. Over nearly 750,000 jobs were created. Textiles and agriculture were the losers, but new jobs, industrial jobs, transport, commercial jobs, professional jobs, manufacturing. There were more opportunities, but still not enough. And that rapidly restructuring economy was not frictionless. Expansion of new and existing jobs did not prevent broken time, unemployment, and, in the language of the day, the redundant classes. So that's my context. And I'm looking at Scotland, which is and remains the coldest part of the UK. So to have a look at that, well, I'm covering the sort of the long 19th century. And if we look at the data that my computer wakes up, it changes the slide. Here we are. This is mean temperature, London, Dublin, and Edinburgh, confirming what we kind of know, that Scotland is on average colder than other parts of this island archipelago. So even in this relatively small island and set of islands of Britain and Ireland, we see this temperature difference. These are in Fahrenheit. So Sir David Brewster, who did this calculation, a leader in the field of optics, champion of the polyzonal lens for lighthouses, but probably more importantly for all of us, the creator of the kaleidoscope, although he never patented it, so never got the profits. But he devised a mathematical model to estimate mean temperature around the world. And so this is his model compared to the observations that we have. And we see no great surprise there that Scotland in 1820 is there measured as the coldest part. If you want to get some more confirmation of this, this is from 1780 to 1801. And this is comparing Edinburgh data with what is called the Central England temperature series. Central England, it's actually got data from London, it's got Oxford, it's got Lancashire, it's actually got the Edinburgh data fed in as well. So it's a little bit almost British, but it is really focused on the Central England area. And you see there that the average temperature across those months and across the year for the period 1780 to 1801, that again, Edinburgh is colder than the Central England data, and Delvine in Perthshire, that is a lovely weather diary that we have access to, shows that perhaps no surprise to the residents of Perthshire, it's one of the coldest places on Scotland. Yet we're acutely aware that temperature is on the rise. So even in this 20-year period of the Perthshire records, we see an increase in Scotland's temperature, or in this part of Scotland. A variation, of course, but a general rise in temperature. And we can see that over the long term, more acutely here. This is our longest run of data, and this is for Edinburgh, with a little bit of Dunfermline thrown in, just in the period 1805 to 1820, when the records were no longer being kept in Edinburgh. And we can see here a great record of variation, but also a steady rise in Scotland's temperature. Now, when you hear about the pre-industrial pivot, the transformation and the rise of global temperature, that's usually taken from a standing point of the 1850, but 1850 to 1900. That's kind of seen as a pre-industrial period. That doesn't fit with what we know about industrialization, but it fits in terms of the emissions of that gross industrialization that really took off at the end of the 19th century. But we've got here a steady rise. We have coldest decades in the 1760s, 1764 to 74, and again in 1811 to 1812. And just to give you a sense of where that temperature rise, to show you how that temperature rise is happening, let me show you the next slide here, which again shows you the long run data with shorter spans. And just to really emphasize how much of a difference that sort of mature industrialized period has on average temperature around England, Scotland, and I guess across Britain. So our long run temperature from 1701 to 1950 is 48.5 degrees Fahrenheit. But then look at these shorter periods, 1901 to 1950, and in particular 1931 to 1950. So we've heard very much about the global effects of climate change, and we have to look at the contribution of industrialisation within Scotland, within Britain, to that, and see this actually as a British issue as much as a global world issue. So that's the kind of the context that this is Scotland, the coldest part of the UK. It's also a part of the country, like all of Britain, that is increasing its temperature over the 19th century, and especially so into the 20th century. And part of my study is to look at the way that meteorology developed as a discipline, to get a sense of what were the concerns, because meteorology really was I wouldn't say the dismal science, but it was a science that was doubted. It didn't have the credibility of astrology, for example, its closest sister discipline. It was often doubted as a simple antiquarianism, just collecting data for the sake of it without any practical purpose. So it's interesting, if you study the origins of meteorology, how attempts were made to give it a justification, to give it a role. And that role was very much to explain agricultural change, issues of health, and issues of both in terms of air quality, in terms of what people were breathing in the towns and cities. And the initial concern was with cold. You know, and quite rightly so. If you look at excess winter mortality, even today, we see that Scotland suffers a higher rate of excess winter mortality than it should, given its base temperature. There are parts of the world that have an average temperature of the year that's colder than Scotland, yet their winter death rate is not as high as it is here. So there's something going on, and that something is usually the damp that Scotland in particular experiences. But let's look at some of the coldest decades versus the highest decades. So this is data that's going from 1764 to 1896, and rank 8 there is that average. So that's the average over that whole span of data. And we can see that 1811 to 1820 is the coldest on average, and that 1764 to 70 period is next in line. Compare that with 1891 to 1896, right at the end of this run, and we see the warmest period. So these were of interest to the early meteorologists who really began in earnest in the 1820s through the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and then the Scottish Meteorological Society from 1855. But let's look at some of this. In 1811, we get a particularly cold year of 1816. It is one of only 2 years where every month is below the average that it should be. 1879 is the other year where again every month was below the average that would be expected. And during that 1878-79 winter, snow fell as early as October and as late as May. And these were years that were particularly bad for agriculture. The price of oats was dear. Of that period, the price of oats in the Edinburgh markets was the second dearest in 1816. So meteorologists, as they tried to examine both the impact on the Highlands, both in terms through some of the work of Sir John Sinclair and the statistical accounts, but also looking at agricultural prices more widely, looked at the impact of climate, particularly on harvests. They were searching for climate causation. They were looking for the laws of meteorology to rival the natural laws of science. They're looking for explanations, causal effects. Because if they could find those causal effects, then they could find credibility for the discipline and for that discipline to grow. Because as ever, my other life is studying nationalism, and as ever with the Scottish Meteorological Society, it's an organisation within civil society. It doesn't get British government funding in the way that the Met Office in London got central government funding from the Treasury. It had to survive as a private subscriber-based society, and that was an issue for the development of the discipline. The Ben Nevis Observatory is another example of that, of funding having to be sought from within the public rather than from the Treasury for that. But climate causation was very much at the heart of it. And we can see various examples of that going through the 18th century onwards. For example, the weather noticeably worsened after the eruption of Iceland's Mount Hekla in 1765. And I had to get mention of Iceland, of course. After that eruption in 1765, the air in Scotland was filled with ash. It was called the Year of Black Snow. Crops were damaged, sunlight reduced. The subsequent cold winters then brought plentiful fish actually towards Scotland's shores, but the persistence of snow and frost led to starvation for people and cattle alike. It was estimated that 40 or 50 families left Jura for North America in 1768 as a result. The journey overseas proved attractive as the cold springs gave little chance of sufficient harvest. These conditions were contrasted with what people thought, or was told to them, of the healthiness of the American climate. And also contrasted with the poor health, again, they were told, of the climate in the West Indies, in Jamaica and Barbados. Another example is the harsh winter of 1771-72. Again, disastrous for crops and family and animals. Prices plummeted. And one estimate was of 1,500 leaving Sutherland for America over the next 2 years. 100 heads of families in Crippen and Stirlingshire were ready to escape the high rents and hunger they were experiencing in 1774, confident that success would come from a soil and climate agreeing with our constitution if they went abroad. So external events have had an impact on Scotland's emigration story. Another example is the Indonesian eruption of Tambora in 1815. The year that followed, 1816, in Scotland was another described as a year of black snow. The volcanic ash would be felt over 1816 and 1817. That winter, going into 1816, was one of the severest, and I've already said 1816 returned the second greatest deviation from the mean, constantly below the average. Looking again over this long period, it was third in days of snowfall, because third worst in terms of snowfall, third worst in terms of rainfall, and also one of the highest for stormy winds. And climatologists look at the impact of volcanic eruptions on windy days. Normally in Scotland, we'd expect 30 gales a day. Sorry, not a day, a year. Let's get in the proportion here. We're not in Edinburgh now. But no, 30 gales a year would be normal. 1816, 67, 1817, 56, 1818, 72 gales were recorded. So unseasonable weather caused by external effects can have particular consequences. And these are the kind of consequences I've argued in this research have fed into the decision to emigrate. And you can also see this in Scotland's warmest period. I said, look there on the table, 1891 to 96, but also number 14 on my ranking, 1841 to 50. Period that encompassed the potato blight hit in 1846. The cool summer of 1845 was followed by a very mild winter, a warm months for the rest of 1846. And it was that warmth that was conducive to the spread of the spores and development of the blight. 1846, the summer of 1846, was the warmest British summer that century, reaching 49.6 degrees Fahrenheit, nearly 3 degrees Fahrenheit above the annual mean. So, and that's the case of a particular climate event exacerbating the potato blight. The cool of 1845 actually stopped it spreading from Ireland into Scotland. But by 1846, the climatic conditions contributed to the blight spreading. Now, I mentioned the pre-industrial pivot was held at COP26, taken to be around about 1850 to 1900. And that's the baseline against which we now examine the threat posed by global warming. It also coincides with the period when we have more complete data on meteorological transformation. The Met Office was established under Vice Admiral Robert Fitzroy in 1853, part of the Board of Trade. In Scotland, as I mentioned earlier, the Royal Society of Edinburgh from 1820 had its meteorological committee under David Brewster, and at one point involved Walter Scott in this, of course. He's always there. And then the Scottish Meteorological Society from 1855. But we also have in this period better data on health. And that gives us an idea of changes or transformation in Scotland's health and illness record over this period when we've got more meteorological evidence and climate evidence than we've ever had before. So the Registrar General for Scotland, its first statistician is James Stark, and he works out the mortality rate for those aged over 80 peaked in the coldest weather, whereas those aged between 40 and 60, levels of mortality reached their height in the onset of winter. Interestingly, the age group whose health was least susceptible to weekly variation in climate were those aged 15 to 20, the young. So if young, we know that infant mortality is incredibly high throughout much of the Victorian period. But we also know it tends to be young men that emigrated. Some certainly late teens, but also early 20s. And they're the ones, according to this evidence, are least susceptible to climate variation, yet it's older generations that were. And that can be analysed in perhaps different ways. So if we look at the data here, this comes from James Stark at the General Register Office of Scotland. This is for 1855, the first sort of annual set of data. And very, very basic, but he's looking at number of deaths that we find. And again, no surprise here that we see the deaths peaking over the winter months and coming down over when it's warmer and going up again, as you see there as we move November into December. And this was contrasted by our meteorologists to the colonial experience of Southeast Asia, the West Indies and Southern Africa, where reports from the British Army were showing how soldiers endured greater illness at times of heat. Whereas in Scotland, greater illness and death was coming out during the cooler temperatures. So this is the kind of thing or the kind of evidence that our meteorologists were particularly interested in. They're looking at these averages. So this is James Stark, as I say, he's a statistician for the General Register Office, but also a council member of the Scottish Meteorological Society. And this kind of evidence could also be linked in to what we know about overcrowding. So a lot of the debate, of course, was on agriculture and improving agriculture, but this data could also be used to look at the towns, because it's in the towns that we have the greater death rate. Scotland was unhealthier in the towns. And we also know that Scotland was a predominantly urban society. Scotland, throughout this 19th century period, was second only to England, sometimes the Netherlands. It was third to the Netherlands, but it's up there as the most urbanized nations in Europe. We're looking at about 83 to 87% living in the Central Belt area. So Scotland is an urban nation, and those are the areas where the health record is much poorer. In 1801, on average, 3.82 people were living in each house in Glasgow, going up to 5.8 in 1811, and coming down a little in the 1830s before again overcrowding increasing by 1841. Sharing rooms as well as beds was commonplace. Scottish urban dwellers had fewer rooms to live in than was the case in different parts of the world. Certainly different comparison to England, for example. If we look at this data here, oops, there we are. This is taken as late as 1900, 1901. We see the preponderance of one-room dwellings in Glasgow, for example, 1 or 2 room dwellings as the norm, in taking it well over the 50% of Scots. Even as late as 1913, around 94% of inhabitants in Edinburgh shared a common water closet, and 43% shared a communal sink in one study. So Scotland is definitely increasingly an urban nation, certainly by the end of the century. And as I say, with evidence for showing that the death rates in the towns was higher, we know the birth rate of babies born to women in Scotland's cities was also lower than to mothers who lived in the borders, the Highlands or lowlands more generally. Babies born to mothers who were labourers or low-paid clerical workers, again, were more likely to deliver underweight babies than women, say, in domestic service who had access to better food. So the cities were incredibly unhealthy. The impact of health of the people of the industrial cities was not just an issue of germ transfer, however, it also had consequences in terms of the impact of the atmosphere. We get evidence of this from Dundee. In 1886, Professor Thomas Carnelly, in collaboration with the medical officer of health for the city, measured the amount of carbonic acid, organic matter, and microorganisms in different classes of houses, and then correlated the results against the city's death rate. So this might have some explanation to Tanya's case study. Comparing the air of the city and suburbs of Dundee, the outskirts of Perth, the average level of carbonic acid and organic matter was found to be greatest in the city centre. It was less in the quieter parts of the city, but then when the dry and wind blew, then the contamination and dust particles led to greater microorganisms, again, in the atmosphere. Carnelly's results also showed that those living in a one-room property were found to be 3 or 4 times greater than in terms of their death rate, rather, than those in larger properties. For those living in one-room properties, the age of death in Dundee was halved. So the average age of life expectancy came down. So impact of one-room properties and the air quality in those rooms. So Carnelly's research, which wouldn't get past our research ethics today, was going into those rooms in the middle of the night and taking measurements on the air quality within people's rooms. It reminds me of actually a cookery book, again, Tanya mentioned earlier, Martha Gordon in 1889. Her advice to would-be housewives was to remember that pure air is food and that polluted air is poison. So the link between overcrowding and spread of disease, confirmed evidence gathered, again, from the British Army abroad, examining the space between hammocks and bunks about the unhealthiness of that close living. And further evidence of this comes from Lord Kelvin. He did some experiments down at Kew Gardens in London, but also in Arran, near his home in Brodick, also at Goat Fell, the highest point in Arran, where he again measured air quality coming over, in this case coming over from Glasgow. As the east wind blew from Glasgow over to Arran, he measured the levels of pollution. Again, his results concluded that the level of the concentration of pollution in Glasgow was greater or equal to that of London and Paris at that point. So climate was clearly an important part of the arguments in colonisation committee and immigration inquiries for particularly the northwest of Scotland, but it also has an impact on the towns where the greater death rates were to be found and where the greater number of migrants came from. So in levels of disease, in terms of bronchial issues and issues of contagion. I was just looking at the number of deaths across Scotland. And the mortality rates, as I say, were highest in the towns. So at a time when the numbers emigrating from Scotland underwent a new phase of growth from mid-century, the analysis of the General Register's Office indicated here that it's the winter months, the cold, and the towns where one should be most worried about the particular concern, one's most worried about one's health. And we know also about the contribution of internal migration and step migration. So step migration to the towns before finally boarding a boat to head for a life overseas, again, includes those who moved into this unhealthy environment of Scotland. And if this is then laid against the attraction of elsewhere, then we see some of the discussion and the influence on decision making that was going on. So while the wind has long been essential to filling the sails of ships that took Scots to places all over the globe, and rain clouds swept the nation clear, the health benefits of going abroad were often extolled. We know the grand tours of Europe, or going over to a spa in Germany, or going over to the Mediterranean, Walter Scott, for example, another good example of that, so means to improve one's health. That's one part of the story. But so too was to the settler colonies, and the idea that the health in each of those climates was better than it would be at home. And various boosters, various pamphleteers would extol the virtues of their particular climate, whether Canada was best, or whether it was New Zealand. What about Australia, that lovely dry wind, but then, ooh, it's a bit hot. Canada, again, it's wonderful in the summer, but you know, the cold does get a bit chilly. And look, in more serious terms, those are the issues we've discussed here, both in terms of, as we see here from a quote from James Stewart that talks about the height that one will grow to if one lived in a place such as Prince Edward Island. He's writing about PEI, talking about the wholesome food. And this was a common kind of argument that one's health, one's height, one's number of children would increase if only one moved to these new lands. And actually, my former colleague at Guelph, Chris Inwood, has done work on height data, and it's interesting how much over 2 or 3 generations, how much taller Scots grow in Canada and Australia than compared to those Scots who stay behind. But that wasn't known to these people. They were just getting these wonderful, somewhat competing, often exaggerated stories about the health properties of going elsewhere. Even as late as 1890, Sir Frederick Napier Broome, Governor of Western Australia, reported to the Select Committee on Emigration that, to his mind, too many sickly migrants were now arriving. He wrote, "Western Australia has such a reputation for the fine climate that there's a great rush of people with delicate constitutions anxious to get out there. I know even my own servants had, half of them, something the matter with their chests." And therefore engaged in that reason. So come to that one in a minute. So these are my climate factors that I've looked at. I've looked at whole, both rural and urban. I focused on the urban example today, just to give you an idea that climate absolutely was influential for those who lived a life outdoors, but it also was influential for those in the more industrializing parts of the city of Scotland, and had a more industrializing life. So I've looked at history of climate variation. I've also, which I haven't really talked about, the circulation of ideas, of climate knowledge. And I've looked at how contemporary meteorological research was searching for this environmental determinism to help explain the persistence of agricultural shortage, identify the conditions that exacerbated the incidence of disease. So does it match up with emigration rates? This is where it gets a little bit more speculative, actually a big bit speculative, but perhaps a little bit of fun, which is just to stick some patterns together and see what we can throw up. Meteorologists were most interested in average temperature at the start in the 1820s and 30s, and then they looked at more complex data, particularly the time taken to reach the highest point in the summer, for example. Here I'm showing deviation from mean and difference between hottest and coldest months to see what patterns we get and whether it matches with any way at all with the levels of sailing. Remember, I put these together while acknowledging that climate is perhaps one of the secondary contributors to emigration, whereas economic demographic factors I would put as the first rank, in the way that Ravenstein, writing in the 1890s, also analysed it in those terms. And here in this data here, just going from 1825 through to 1850, we see where the annual temperature deviates from the mean, which is the lower set of dots. We see there's a bit of an association up to around the 1840s, There's a little bit of a pattern following in step, although it kind of disappears a little bit in the second half from the 40s and 50s. But what we see perhaps a greater association here is the top line, which is the difference between the hottest and coldest months. And what we're getting is a similar pattern, but with a delay of about 2 to 3 years. So it is suggestive to that extent, and as I say, I'm not pushing this, it's extensive to that extent that where there's greater upset, and that as measured by greatest deviation from the hottest and coldest months, then if that's followed by increased wind, increased damp, increased frost, then the challenge both to agriculture and both to health might have an impact on the way that people then make up that decision to go and to seek life elsewhere. As I say, the purpose of my research was not to show this or attempt to show this correlation. I'm not looking for a mechanistic coefficient here. What I'm looking for is to see some patterns and to look at how the circulation of knowledge and understanding changed over this period. But I also looked at average as well. This one, I actually just a graph I just did quite recently, and this one I found a little bit surprising, but also quite intriguing. This is just looking at Scotland's average, Edinburgh's average temperature, which I showed you earlier, and then put it with the annual passenger movements from 1853 to 1896. And not the delay here of 2 to 3 years as such, although the data is too broad to find that out. We'd have to look a little bit more closely, but we do see a remarkable confluence of the pattern here. But this really does mask a much more complex range of climate, demographic and economic factors. I think it's fun to do this, but there's a much more complex picture that's going on. And, you know, to analyze this, it has to be done in terms of circulation of knowledge, alongside the more usual analysis on occupations, on fractured employment, and also on emigration schemes, and all the other impacts on timing that are out there. I've tried to give you some suggestions here that the impact that climate had, both in less so in the countryside, although I haven't focused on the countryside, but also in the towns. And this kind of evidence, I think, is a useful one for linking into the more cultural evidence on connections. So we heard about homecoming. Well, for many a Burns society or Burns supper in Canada, we'll have the toast to the twa lands of Scotland and Canada, or America and Scotland. Land and homeland fit so much. Descriptions of homeland and following the language of Scott, but also talking about their memories. It's interesting that oral interviews with migrants invites them to talk about their first impression of arriving in the new land. This is early 20th century. And their first impression is always one based about the weather and about the contrast from home in terms of the weather around them, the climate and the sun and the heat, or the cold. Some lovely examples of arriving in the cold and not really appreciating just how cold it would be. So the climate reasons, the pressures and incentives that resulted in the movement of people have been neither straightforward nor uniform. As I've stressed, there are known structural features that contextualize Scotland's immigration experience. My aim, though, has been to show the extent to which climate determinism changed behaviour in these 2 centuries before climate change reached the present point of crisis. And with that, I hope I made some contribution to explaining why so many Scots removed themselves from a temperate climate to live permanently in parts of the world where greater temperature extreme was the norm. And on that point, I shall stop. Thank you. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very, very much, Graeme. That was fascinating. I mean, I love everything about it. It's, you know, as an environmental historian, it's absolutely up my street. And I'll take the the privilege of chairing for the moment to ask a couple of questions here. One was the height of immigrant children thing, and of course in this there is the big dietary differential around about the immigrant children having a significantly higher protein content in diet than parents and the people back home in Scotland. Is that something that's coming through in any of the discourse around this?
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, there is by the 1890s, there's some great studies done, well, slightly weird studies done actually, on admissions into Edinburgh Royal Infirmary on cyclonic or anticyclonic wind. Does that make an influence? Does that have an influence on heart attacks, for example? They're looking at different climatic impacts on health. But yeah, it does fit into the wider issues of nutrition and therefore leading on to that from height. So I trawled through the two statistical accounts, for example, and looked at how climate information was used to explain the success of each of the parishes, or the economic success and or the health of the people. And it's interesting, firstly, that you can see the influence of meteorology as a discipline between the 1790s and the 1840s. They're much more attuned to the kind of arguments of the meteorologists by the 1840s and looking to be more systematic. But they do talk a lot about how a particular climate can have an impact on longevity. So it's lovely examples of great climate here, people live to 120 kind of statement, but also just about the general health of the crops and therefore of the population. So it is there, but it is fascinating that the height data, because it's done from British Army records in Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. So you look at, as it were, Canadian born or Scots of Canadian heritage, and look at how their average height, as you can see, change.
Yeah, because that was one of the things. It was a paper I heard at the American Society for Environmental History conference a couple of years ago, which was looking at American Army data and looking at the immigrant status of some of the families, and it was the way in which some of the children of Scots and Irish descent were ending up, around about 6 inches to 8 inches taller than parents. And I was looking at the dietary input there, just the vast amounts of meat that was being consumed that wasn't available to the people back home in Scotland.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think it is to do with meat. And if you look at the colonization circular or other pamphlets that were there and telling people about what to expect, and everyone was claiming to tell the truth, then there are price charts there on food and oats and wheat. But it's also, stories about what wonderful things you can grow. So New Zealand always has the exotic fruit that could be grown, and you just imagine, Scots are being invited to go and start their vineyard in New Zealand, and how much wonderful that will be for them, which is great, but it's quite a contrast to for normal Scots.
Now, I don't want to dominate things here because there's so many questions you could ask, Graeme, but there was one thing. I posted a question actually to you in the chat, which was, are you familiar with the James Fife diaries from Kirriemuir, which are predominantly 1830s, early 1840s?
Well, I haven't looked at
and it was something that you were saying. Now, Fife was a small tenant farmer and a cattle drover and dealer, and he gets into terrific debt in the late 1830s, early 1840s, and considers emigrating. And a lot of his indebtedness, well, partly he's completely incompetent, but some of his indebtedness is due to the climatic conditions of the time. And I'm just wondering if you're picking up anything about emigration being seen as an escape from that kind of indebtedness as a result of the dire conditions back home in Scotland.
Yeah, absolutely. There's actually a Flora MacDonald letter that does exactly that to the Mackenzies of Delvine, where we got that. I was showing you that data earlier, where she talks about the conditions that we've had. There's also cultural stories as well. So there's a Canadian publisher in the 1850s and 60s who tells lots of popular stories, and those include stories of Scots leaving just because of that. Because of the poor conditions of home. And I've also got a lovely bit of evidence from a New York St Andrews Society, where the speaker comes and does the usual toast to the Twa Lands kind of thing. This is wonderful how Scots are their prosperity is coming. But then he goes back and writes up this story, and there's concern that people are focused on the beauty of Scotland and not focused on the difficulties of that particular climate. So at one moment he's there, I'm a true Scot working away from home, celebrating St Andrews, and then he comes back and goes, actually, we've got to help this society here. We've got to either try and keep people on the land, or we've got to try and improve their conditions. So yeah, I think that there are stories there, and it's a big part of a lot of the kind of published literature about why, the promotion, the booster literature that's saying come and live in PEI or come and live in parts of America. There's really climate arguments are dominant to say you'll not suffer that kind of poverty again because this climate is so conducive to a better lifestyle.
Okay, good, excellent. Really interesting. Something I think I'll follow up on. Now, I've got two questions in here. Currently in the chat. First one from Sandra Davison. From the graphs broken down by months, the overall temperature is increasing, yet mainly in the winter months. Would it be true to say that climate change is overall resulting in warmer winters more than warmer summers, thus impacting agriculture even today?
Well, I think, yeah, in a sense, the data I showed you is picking up the end of the little ice age, the real end of it. It has various end points, but certainly it's gone there, and that seems to be an impact there, as you say, on warmer winters. It's for most of what I'm looking at, it's kind of transition periods that are really seen as the most dangerous ones. The kind of transition between spring and summer or autumn going into winter. And that transition period, which can have an impact, particularly on when the harvests are taken. So that's one of the things that the early meteorologist, James Forbes in particular, looks at is, time to height of summer, and then how long till you can get the harvest in, and do you get poor weather before you can do that? And that's looking at the quality of the harvest that you then get in. So yeah, those kinds of variations, I think are particularly important. And I think it's not really warmer summers, you're right. And I think as we see with global warming, it's going to be quite wet. So they might feel warmer, but there'll be a lot of rain with them, which is very Scottish.
Yeah, I think the thing to bear in mind with the warmer winters, it's the 6 degrees daytime temperature differential, which is the critical point for grass growth, and particularly if you're a livestock farmer. It's what can you graze animals on outside and know that the grass is going to continue to grow, and what do you need to be providing winter fodder for. So if you're getting warmer winters, there's a greater chance that you're going to be able to feed your animals on naturally growing biomass rather than what you've got to buy in.
And that was kind of certainly the Sir John Sinclair stuff in the arguments in 1820s and 30s was very much looking at that, and particularly they're comparing with clearing land to try and avoid damp and to increase the temperature. So there's the argument of clearing the land in America would contribute to warmer temperatures, and that was then proposed for Scotland also.
Right. Now, the second question I've got here, it's a really interesting one from Bill Patterson. According to oral family history, a great-grandfather in the late 19th century spent some years as young married man and father working as a stonemason in Angus in the summer and as a lumberjack in Canada in the winter. Would such, inverted commas, commuting have been very unusual and possibly slightly exaggerate figures for emigration?
It's an interesting one. I've two points to my answer. One is I have a lovely critique of all that booster literature. Says, says, look at all these discussions or invitees to stonemasons to come and work in Canada. When, wait a minute, there's not a lot of stone buildings to work on, so you're being lied to. But a more serious point is absolutely, I know Marjorie Harper has got some evidence there of Scots who would make that seasonal. She's looked at Scots working in Canada, working down the St. Lawrence until it froze, and then coming back to Scotland. So the extreme winter of Canada would then force them to come back and work in Scotland. So yeah, I think there is evidence there that of that experience of working the two economies, and as you say, dependent on climate. So yeah, it's a great example. I'd love to hear more about it, but I know that Marjorie Harper, I think she's done some oral history on it as well, and has found some examples like that.
Yeah, I mean, I know from working on Papastour back in the 1980s, where there were family members who did exactly that. They would come and go between Shetland and Canada to help out back home on the family property, and then return to Canada for the rest of the year. So, right down into the late 20th century, still getting that transatlantic migration, seasonal migration.
Yeah, well, I have another example, which is the leader of the Scottish National Party in the 1950s, Douglas Young, who comes down the road from me from Tayport, and his father worked in near Bombay in the jute industry in India, and he made his poor wife come back every year for 20 years. And insisted that the kids be, where possible, born in Scotland, and certainly to go to school in Scotland. But yeah, that's a heck of a journey every year for 20 years.
Well, there's a choice between Bangladesh or Calcutta and Dundee. And Dundee, of course, is the greatest city on the planet, as we know. As a native Dundonian, I can say, yes, despite what Tanya was saying about how horrendous it could be in the 19th century. But anyway, that's been great. Thank you very, very much, Graeme. It's a great paper. I'm looking forward. I haven't had a chance yet to read some of your more recent work on this climate data, and it's very germane to a lot of what I'm doing just now. So I'm really looking forward to getting to grips with more information. I'll be knocking on your door. Literally rather than just figuratively. I'm on a year's research leave.
Oh my goodness, such a thing exists.
So thank you very much. I would also like to take this opportunity as the outgoing president to thank everyone who's contributed to this afternoon's conference for a series of wonderful contributions. I mean, all of them held together coherently as possibly one of the best groups of papers that I've heard in many a year. It's been absolutely fantastic, and I think virtually all of us, I don't mean virtually all of us, I mean virtually electronically all of us will be giving a great round of applause to you for just a superb collection of papers, all four of you. It's been a superb afternoon.